Begin the current daf, Mesechtes Bava Kama Daf Pei Vav. We begin on the bottom of Pei Mid Beis, full ends up at the bottom of the Amid. The Gemara is in the middle of discussing Sheves. We opened up the Perik HaChaybel on the Pei Mid Beis, the first Mishnah, the Chamisha Dvarim that a person's chayiv for injuring another person. Nezik Tzar, Reaper, Sheves, and Beishas. And now we're discussing Sheves, which is the loss of work. Turn to the Daf Chaim, turns today's daf, Chosva, Achidim Neisol, and Eretz Yisrael, and throughout the entire world. So I'm discussing today's daf, are Hakiteya Yad Shal Eved Every. If someone cuts off the hand of a Jewish slave, how do you qualify the Sheves? Because ultimately the slave is getting his hand cut off, but the loss of work is really from the master. Of the halacha baishas, we continue to the last item of how do you qualify baishas. We have many different opinions of baishas. And the Gemara actually discusses one's liability for humiliating people, different types of people. So you have avadim, a slave. Does an ebed have baishas? Assume a blind person who doesn't even see what's happening, cutting a child. Haram, someone that's unclothed, he's already embarrassed. Hayashin, someone's asleep, doesn't realize what's going on. And shaitan, the same person, the Gemara qualifies if they have, and it could actually depend on when or what, if they have baishas. What happens if niskaman l'bayishazeh and bayishazeh? What if you intend to embarrass one person and you embarrass someone else? Are you liable for that? And even if you would be, how you do qualify that shame? You didn't intend to shame that person, you intend to shame a different type of a person. And Allah Yashin Vesuma Shabish, a sleeping person or a blind person, if they embarrass someone, are they going to be liable? Baisha Yashin Amace. What's the Allah the Gemara discuss? Let's say you embarrass someone who's sleeping and he dies. What's the significance of that? So generally, if you embarrass someone that's sleeping, when he wakes up, he realizes he was shamed. But here, the guy died in his sleep, so he doesn't even end up realizing what happened. What would the halacha be? That depends, as the Gemara is going to explain, what is the rationale for the liability of baishas. And then the Gemara discusses regarding summa, the halacha of a blind person regarding the halacha first of baishas, and then it discusses summa as we continue to the next daf in many different contexts, if a summa is going to be liable or not. To begin the current daf Pehei Beis, 4 lines up at the bottom of the Amid, Boyu Rabba. Rabba has the following question. Sheves hapoichasei bedamim. So Rashi explains, what is this talking about? If, let's say, somebody gets an injury that he has to stop working, at the end, he's going to be healthy as he was in the beginning. So essentially, all you have over here is really Sheves. He's just going to be missing work. But currently, his value is worth less. If they were to sell him right now, he would fetch a lower price. Now, Tais explains why that is. The bottom Tais, he says that besides for the loss of work of every single day until he gets healed, his value goes down. Now, why is his value going down? Because people are not so bakeen, they're not so proficient to recognize in his hand, let's say that was injured, if it's going to heal or not. So people would not put themselves in the situation of doubt to acquire such an eved, right? That's how we celebrate, that's how we evaluate the damages, to purchase like as if he was a healthy person who had full range of his 2 hands. They think maybe he's not going to get healed. Because Tais says, if it was known that for sure he's going to go back to how he originally was, Abaye would agree that you only give the Sheves of every single day, which we're going to see this Amachlikas Abaye and Rabba, this exact question. So this case is specifically where he's going to come back to the health that he originally was, but the way Tais qualifies is like, it's still his value goes down temporarily, because people wouldn't purchase such a person because they don't really know definitively if he's going to go back to what he originally was. Mahu, what's the halacha? Do we hold the perpetrator liable for the deficiency of his value right now or not? Which really, that's a code word for nezek. No, we know this type of injury is going to come back. So the question is, who's we? But people, it says, B'nai Adam. Bezdin knows, right? But B'nai Adam and Apakin, so his value right now temporarily goes down. Is there such a liability of that, that the Pchisas Dam or not? So the Gemara says, wait a second, Hechdem, what's the case talking about? The Gemara is trying to figure out, when do you have an injury that doesn't really injure the person for nezek, but that temporarily his value goes down. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you, Kugun Shikol Yadai. We hit him on his hand, but some Yadai, his hand shriveled up, but the Sefer Lachs is going to end up healing. What's Allah? Keeping the Sefer Lachs, since his ending is going to come back to regular, he's not going to give him anything for the value of his hand, because he's giving him for whatever work is missing, but he's not going to pay for the damim of his hand of nezik. Right now, you depreciate the value of his hand, so that you have to compensate him for. So Gemara says, Tashmat's being arrived a Mishnah later on the Pizayin Madalf. The Mishnah says, Hamaka of ve'imoy. Someone hits his father or his mother. Now, he didn't make a wound, which that means to say that the blood has to rise from with the capillaries.
It says Malka, though. It doesn't say it's not Malka, the actual what Malka is, right? What's the pasuk say?
Right. So we say that the Gemara says Sanhedrin that Pedal learns out that you're not chayiv misa for having inflicted a wound in the parents until you make a chabura. Meaning, although it says the word Malka, you're not going to be chayiv for just hitting them. It has to make a chabura. The Gemara there learns out the sorts for that. But the point of the Mishnah on that Pezayin is saying, what happens if you hit your father and your mother and you don't make a wound? The blood doesn't get removed from the capillaries to rise to the surface. Or another case, someone interests his friend on Yomi Kippurim. So Yomi Kippurim, of course, you're not allowed to do malacha, but it's not a chiv mises bezdin as it is for Shabbos. So the halacha is, as we continue to pay Bava Manalev, and then we'll see this Mishnah of Pezayin, but chayiv bekulan. So usually you have kimle b'drabim. If you made a chabur in your parents, you wouldn't be liable for other monetary liability. If you did a chabal on Shabbos, you wouldn't be chayiv. But if it was times that there's no chayiv misa bezdin, like on Yom Kippurim or the parents, but he didn't make chabura, then you chayiv b'kulam min yichayiv and all the chamisha dvarim of injuring a person. Your parents are also people that are you're liable for injuring them for nezik tari b'shavas and paishas. Okay, that's what the Mishnah says over there. The question is, what is this case that you're telling me that there could be hezek, that you could damage somebody without making a wound? Lav kugoin, isn't it this case? Shekol yadoy, that you hit the father, let's say, on his hand, and it's shriveled up. But Seifalachs is going to end up coming back. And what does the Mishnah say? Chayiv bikulan. You're liable for all of them, including the halacha of nezek, which is the damim of the yad. Well, what do you mean? What are you paying for his hand? His hand's going to come back to regular. Oh, because temporarily it's not. And as Rashi explains, you can't say that it's talking about where it's not going to end up coming back to as it normally was, because if there's no chabura, then that means it's going to come back to what it was. So obviously this is the case, and therefore you see that you do have to pay for the temporary p'chisas dam. That answers our question. They said no. It's not a raya. What are we talking about in the Mishnah Daf Pezayin? You're in shiur. When the Mishnah said you hit your father and your mother and they didn't have a chabura, what type of hit is that has these chamisha dvarim? Is you made him deaf. And you're right. You never made a wound that you bloodied him. You just made him go deaf. So there's nezek. He doesn't have his hearing anymore. Tsar, ripoy, shebes, paishas, all those things are there. So there's no raya to the case we're trying to ask regarding. Says, really? It's shiur. But Rabba says, if someone makes his father deaf, nerag, he gets killed, and therefore, again, if he gets killed, he's obviously the main point is really the next thing. Because why does he get killed? I thought he didn't make a chabura. No, it's not possible to make him go deaf without making some type of a wound. Because tips of the dama, there's a drop of blood that falls there in his ear when it makes him go deaf, and therefore you made a chabura. So then he gets killed because if someone makes the father have a wound, that's the Torah says he gets killed. But one thing is, that's obviously not a good option to tell me that I could tell you in case there's no chabura, make him go deaf, because making him go deaf, there was a chabura. So this is no, okay, I'll come up with a different answer that will reject the raya. Look at my skin on the Mishnah over there. What's it talking about that he hit his father but didn't make a chabura? It's talking about kagon shegilchay, where he shaved his hair, where his value went down now. It was damaging him without making a chabura. The Gemara says, what? Gilchay? He shaved off his hair? Mahadahadar, hair comes back. Bind, that's exactly the question. In other words, what's the difference if it's hair or hand? At the end, it's coming back, and still you're holding him liable for nezek. Obviously, that a temporary p'chisas damim, you're chayiv nezek for. So what are you helping? It's still going to be a raya. They said, no, we're talking about where he smeared a cream, a depilatory cream that removes the hair, the loy hadar, where the hair is not going to come back anymore. And that is damaging because you're depreciating from his value, because that's a blemish. So now that he doesn't have this hair anymore, it's a permanent damage, like not having a hand anymore. So that's nezek. And then you have tsar, you have pain. Why is there pain? Where's the chamisha dvarim when you make his hair, when you take off all his hair, is the islay kartufne berdeshe, because now he has these scabs on his on his head, v'tzavochi mahani kartufni, and it pains him from these like what's that called again? You have on your head these no, not scabs, but more like no, there's different like bumps. There's like bumps that people have on their head, whatever. But that bothers him because of the also the strong of the pain. The potion is also causing him tsar. So there's two things: the kartufni bereshi, and he screams from these from the strength of the poison that was the potion, the cream that was put on his head. And you have ripui, you have the boya asuye, because he needs to be healed from the pain of this kartufni, of these of whatever these scabs are. And sheves, why is there loss of work over here? They have a market bekubi. So let's say the guy used to dance in the bars. The boy machve gavne aresha, that he has to show like he shakes his head to show like some type of like I guess break dancers, he has his hat fly off and hat fly on, some type of jokes when he shows his head like the jokers, and that's what he used to do until now. Now he's not going to do that anymore because of these scabs. And even though it didn't stop him from doing other work, but he has to give him this Shabbos because that was his work. And that's what Tais actually in the previous daf says, that we qualify when we say the Shem Kishu and all these different types of things. If a guy didn't have a specific job, if he got a specific job, we don't qualify like say you're missing a hand, like a Shem Kishum and all that. This guy had the job where he was a dancer in the bars, and now he can't do that anymore because it's shameful for his head. And boishes shame no greater shame where the guy's head is shaved off. That's why it's such a solidarity people have going through Yanamais, and people say it's a shameful thing. So you have all these different things that apply, and therefore again it wouldn't be a raya from the Mishnah on Daf Pei Zayin, because I can tell you it's a different case. It's not the case where you did some type of pchisis damim without any nezik. So that's the question. So it's not resolved. But the Gemara says, this question that was asked by Rabbi, Abaye took it that it was obvious to him in one way. According to Rabbi, it was obvious to him the other way. So both of them answered the question, but in opposite ways. Like we learned, it's actually machlekes between Abaye and Rabbi. If someone hits someone on his hand, but some send it shrivels, it's going to end up coming back. But like for a few weeks or a few months, his hand is shriveled up. Abaye Amar, he says like this. He says, Noisin loy sheves gedoylo. He gives him the big sheves. What's the big sheves? Means the value of his hand, meaning it's code word for nezik, let's say. V'sheves ketana. And the small sheves, meaning every single day that he's in bed, we see as if he's a shemikeshuin, which is because you're already getting compensated for the hand, even though it's a temporary compensation. And then without a hand, what could you do? You could watch shemikeshuin, and now you can't even do shemikeshuin because you're in bed. So that's what the two things we compensate you. But Rav, he says no. He says no. You only give him the shevis of every single day until he comes back to how he originally was. You give him every single day how much he was getting paid as a worker, not just as a shemikeshum. Because Rabbah holds you don't give him the value of the hand. So the question that was asked by Rabbah is machlekes Abaye Rabbah. Abaye says yes, you do give him the damim of his hand yad, and even though it's temporary, and Rabbah says no, you don't. And therefore, when we're going to give him shevis, is one shevis of a guy with a hand, because we're not compensating for the hand. So the guy with the hand, what type of job could he have? That's what you give him throughout his illness. Now, a related machlekes itmar, we learned the following case: if someone literally cuts off, not the case that we spoke about before of sefer lachzer, it's not coming back. He cut off the hand of someone else's Jewish slave, so a regular Jew, but he's a slave. We know if a guy steals or whatever, he sells himself. A slave of another Jew is a Jew, and someone else cuts off that slave's hand. So Abaye Amar says like this: you give the large shevis. Remember, the large shevis is code word really for like nezik. The fact that he doesn't have a hand, you give that to the slave. So as Taisus in Divrei Maskal Shevis Gedoylo Levet says, because this Eved Ivri is leaving after 6 years. When he leaves, we need him to go out full-bodied with his hands. The fact that he doesn't have a hand because it was cut off, well, that compensation goes to him. So the Shevis is going to the Eved. The Shevis Ketana L'Rav. And the small Shevis, that's going to the master because that's the daily work that's being missed. That has to go to the master. Now Taisus is bothered. He says, wait a second. If this hand or leg wouldn't have been cut off, this slave wouldn't have been just a Shemik Yeshuin. He would have been drawing buckets and he would have been going on missions. And now he can't but to be Shemik Yeshuin and watch the Pesach. And that's the Shevis Ketana. Because you're already giving the Shevis Ketana to the Eved. So what's this that the master is only getting the Shevis Ketana? That's not his loss. His loss is bigger than that. So it says Taisus, we consider the Eved like the halacha of when the Eved becomes sick. The Gemara in Kedushin tells us that if an Eved becomes sick, although he can't work, he doesn't have to make it up. Because we call it nestachvas today, we say that it's the loss, it's the mazel, bad mazel of the master. Now, I says Taisus, even though the Gemara says over there but if the majority of the years of the Eved he was sick, he has to make it up. So here, if let's say his hand got cut off a week into the job, we say that the master is going to be losing. So it says no. That when the guy becomes sick, the Eved, he can't do any work. So okay, the majority of the thing, then you got to make it up. But here he could do some type of work. He could be Shemik Yeshun or Shemah HaPesach, and therefore, although the master is losing, even as the majority will say that that's all he's getting is like a Shemik Yeshun and Shemah HaPesach. Okay, that's the way Abaya learns. But Rava, he says, no, Hakol Yunasan LeEved, everything is given to the slave, because again, remember, Rava only doesn't divide into Shevis Gedolah, Shevis Ketana. It doesn't hold as a Shevis Gedolah. You just get Shevis, which is loss of work. So everything is given to the slave. V'lokach ben karka, and so, but Lamaisa, the master is also losing because actually he's the one who owns the Eved. But Lamaisa, the Eved's the one whose the hand is shriveled. So, actually had his hand cut off, which obviously you have to compensate him. But so what happens is, v'lokach ben karka, you purchase a property, and the master eats the payers. So really, that makes sense because whose hand is it? It's the master's hand. It's the Eved's hand. So he gets compensated, but the master's losing out of this hand. So that's the payers. So let the master eat the payers. Taisus, however, doesn't like this girsa. He says actually the girsa should be not hakol yinosan le'eved, but hakol yinosan le'rav. And that's what the girsa Rabbeinu Chananel. He says this girsa that we have in our Gemara, hakol le'eved, he says difficult because the sheves ketana, the amount of work that's lost, why shouldn't that all be to the master? Rather, the girsa is hakol le'rav. And what the halacha is, the sheves ketana, the small amount of loss, everything goes to himself, meaning to the master. Sheves gedolah, which is the big loss of work because his hand was cut off, that you purchase a property, and that the master eats the payers, because that he's losing out from the guy's hand being cut off, where he cannot do the bigger shlichus than he could have done of drawing the buckets and going agency, and he can only be Shemik Yeshon Pesach. That's where Rabba learns. So that's a different gears of Taisus to understand what do you do when this Eved's hand gets cut off, where it's a temporary loss, not for the Eved, obviously, a temporary loss for the master. What do? Do you say everything's given to the Eved, and because his hand gets cut off, of course, and then the master eats the produce? Or like Taisa says, no, the Sheves Ketana automatically gets given to the master. That's the small amount of loss of the daily work of the lesser amount, and the Sheves Gedolah, that actually is that goes to the Eved, and then the master will get the payers of that. But either way, continues the Gemara, Pshita, the Gemara just follows through and says, what's obvious is like this. Pichis etzel atzmai. Let's say there's a depreciation for the slave himself. But the master, there's no depreciation because it's not stopping him from work. What case would that be? Says the Gemara, the paske l'resh une or l'resh nechide. Let's say the tip of his nose or the tip of his ear was cut off by someone else, by a perpetrator. So the master is not losing any work from this Eved, but obviously it's a Bechisis Damin regarding the Eved. So Akola Atzmai, everything goes to the Eved himself. What happens to Pichas Eitzel Rabbi? So here you have a different interpretations, Rashi, Taisus, but the Rashi says is that it means also for his master, not just for the Eved himself. For example, let's say cuts of his hand. Oh, so that's the Plukti, the Baya of Rava. That's the Machlek, the Baya and Rava, like we said, where it's not only bad for the Eved, it's also depreciation for the master. So Machlek Zabai and Rabba, do we split it up? Do we do a Sheves Gedolah, Sheves Ketana type of a thing, or like Rabba holds? No, we never split it up. And there's one thing, and the two different Gersois we had with Taisus and Rashi regarding if that's going to all go to the Eved, and then you give the master the payers. Taisus doesn't like this because he says, we already said this of the machlekes with Keteyat Evet Ivri. Why would we say this again of Plukta Dabai Rava? So therefore Taisus actually says a different pshat, that you could actually say it's Toman only, not the way Rashi says that Af Eitzel Rabbi. It's only Pichas Eitzel Rabbi. And for the Evet, there's no Pchisus. It's still machlekes Abai and Rava. How so? So, for example, let's say he hit him on his hand, and his hand shriveled, and it's end up coming back before he goes out free. According to Abaya, you give the Shevetz Katana to the master, and the Shevetz Katana goes to the Evet. And even though the Evet is not losing out anything, because his hand's going to come back before he leaves, and the whole loss is to the master, but since it's called Nezik, that's what Shevetz Katana is, really Nezik, and the Nezik of Ketiyas Yad, the master doesn't have even the payers according to Abaya, so this Hezek also is not going to take anything. Whereas according to Rava, the master is going to take everything, which is the Shevetz of every single day. So therefore, that's where the Re gives a different interpretation for that case. Be that as it may, we continue with the next item that was mentioned in the Mishnah of assessing baishas. We spoke about nezek, tsar, ripui, sheves, and now up to the last item of baishas, of shame. Says the Mishnah, kolafi amavayish v'amazbayish. So when you're embarrassing someone, it depends on two criterion: who's doing the embarrassing and who's getting embarrassed, and it depends. It's subjective for that. Says the Gemara, Mani Masnin, who's the Tanav Mishnah? So the Gemara says, Loi Rameya, V'loi Rabbi Yehuda. It's not like any of these two Tanoim. El Rabbi Shimon, he must be like Rabbi Shimon. It's not, which actually is a Brisa. The Brisa brings different opinions regarding how to evaluate Baishas. V'kulon, all of them, meaning whether poor people or wealthy people, Royunoisan, we see them, meaning even if they're wealthy, we see them Ki'iluhem b'nei chayrin, as if they were free people, Sheyardu minech sehen, that lost their assets, and we don't evaluate the poor person according to his poverty to like be lenient, because a poor person is used to being ashamed, so he doesn't get so embarrassed, and not a wealthy person according to his wealth, because there's no end to the value of that shame. Rather, we do it equal for all of them, because as Taisus explains, the Masla Ki'ilu, he says, how are we able to do this? Because why do we pick B'nei Chayrin Sheyardu Mechsein? Because there are certain wealthy people that don't get more embarrassed than a regular free person that lost his money, and so do poor people. There's certain poor people that have a little bit more pride, and you can't be so medactic so much which one of them is embarrassed as if he did lose his money, which one is embarrassed more or less. So therefore, as Tais says, we find other places in Shas that you can't exactly to know this guy, he's going to be shamed with this or that. So we just pick one thing that's really a median, like somewhere in the middle. Shem b'nei Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, which like free people that lost their status, which we are all like that because we had the status with the bottom of Avram Yitzchak, Yaakov, but we're in Galus. So that's the Remei, that's the opinion of Remei, where like we assess everyone equally, like wealthy people who fell on hard times. That's how you evaluate them. That's like somewhere in the middle. Opinion number two, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, Hagad lefi gadloi. The greater the person according to his greatness, and the smaller one according to how small he is. Shimon he says, no. Ashirim, the wealthy, we view them as if they're free people who are on hard times. Aniyim, and the poor people are kapchusin shebehem, that the lowest of the poor are going to be more lenient, because since he's a poor person, his shame is lesser. Says the Gemara, okay, we have three different opinions how to qualify shame. Mani, who's the Tana of our Mishnah? So the Gemara goes through. Meir, if you're going to think it's the first opinion of Meir, but it can't be. Why? Because Masnitin Katani, our Mishnah taught, Hakalafi Amavayish Vamazbayish. Everything goes according to the one who's shaming and being ashamed. Now, Meir, he doesn't make it subjective. He gives one unit, Kulu Bahade Adadin, and they're all the same. He gives it Sheyardu Minich Sehen. So obviously he's not the Tana of the Mishnah. Tana number two, Rabbi Yehuda, we think it's Rabbi Yehuda, but Masnid because now Mishnah taught Mabayish as Asuma Chayev. Someone embarrasses a blind person, he's Chayev. Can't be. Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda, I mean, he says Suma in le Baishas, as we'll see on Amid Beis. Rabbi Yehuda says that a blind person doesn't have shame. So if he doesn't have shame, you're not going to be Chayev when you're shaming him. And our Mishnah says you are Chayev. Elalav, rather must be the third Tana, Rabbi Shimon, because as Rashi explains, Shimon also didn't say everyone is the same. He didn't say that you give exact, like, he said, okay, well, all wealthy will put it like shiur not saying, but anima less. So it is dependent on hamavayish ramazbayish. So he's the Tana. Says the Gemara, no, not necessarily. I feel Tam Rabbi Yehuda. You could even say the Tana of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. How so? Here, Rabbi Yehuda, when does Rabbi Yehuda say suma ein lebaishis, that a blind person doesn't have shame? That's lemishkol mine. That's to take from him. Meaning, if a blind person embarrasses someone else, he's not chayiv. But to give to the blind person, he's shamed. You do give to him, and therefore he could be the Tana Mishnah that says Mavayish as a Machayev. And Yehuda does say it's subjective to who the person is. Says it can't be, because when the Tani Seifa, the end of the Mishnah says Mavayish es hayashan chayev. It says if someone embarrasses a sleeping person, he's michayev, and it says v'yashan shebayish pater. But a sleeping person that embarrasses someone else, he's pater. The Loikatani doesn't say suma shebayish pater. It doesn't say that a blind person that embarrasses someone else is going to be pater. Why doesn't it say that also? It's telling me that it's suma. If you embarrass a suma, you can be chayiv, and so why doesn't it tell me the suma that embarrasses someone else is pater? The inference is that it doesn't make a difference. The blind person is gonna be chayiv whether he is embarrassing someone else or someone's embarrassing him. Well, Rabbi Yehuda said that a suma has no baishas, and you're trying to tell me that when does he not have a baishas? When he embarrasses someone else. So why doesn't it say suma shabayish pater? Al machvar to masin Rabbi Shimon. Rather, obviously, it's clear. You're right. The Tana of the Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Yehuda, and we already pointed out it's not Rabbi Meir, and therefore must be the Tana Rabbi Shimon. And again, even Rabbi Shimon wasn't exactly that everyone's hakol mafia exactly down, but it's still there was some differentiation, and therefore he could be the Tana of the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, "Man Tana lahad Tana Rabbanu." Who's the Tana that we learned in the Brisa? The Brisa says like this: "Niskavan levayish es hakatan uvayish es hagadol." Let's say someone intended to embarrass a small person and embarrassed a big person. So nisan legadol demei b'shasish hakatan. Interestingly, he has to give to the big person the amount of shame of how much that small person would have had, because that was my intention. As we'll see in the base, you only chayv achin niskaven until you have intention. So I intended to shame a small person. I ended up shaming a big person. So even though you have to compensate him, but you only have to compensate him according to the value of the small person that you intended to shame. It's a good question. You want to know meaning if you thought that he was one type and then you saw that he was someone else. It's a good question. Does that go into that? But you meant him. What? How do you evaluate shame? Yeah, it's a good question. It probably is related to how much would a person be willing to pay exactly to have not that experience exactly. Let's say Levayish is Eved. Let's say he intended to embarrass a slave. Levayish has been chayrin, embarrassed a free person. So nice in the ben the baby by shas Eved. You can give to the free person the value of how much the shame would be of a slave. Now, Mani, who's the town of this brisa? Now this is Loy Reb Meir, V'Loy Yehuda, B'Loy B'Shimon. This sounds like not like any one of the opinions we had mentioned up until this point. Why? So the Gemara explains first the premise that the Gemara was assuming in translating the brisa. Because Salka Daitach, you would think to say that when we said katan, what does it mean a small person? It means katan ben a chasim. That's what the Gemara assumed. It means a guy who's not so wealthy. Gadol, a big person, was gadol ben a chasim, was big with assets. Okay, now I'll tell you why it doesn't sound like it could be any one of the Tanoim. Because Meir ha'amakul about the other. He said that everyone is the same. Doesn't make a difference if you're Ashir Maniyim, you're going to get the same amount. So obviously, he's not the Tana of the Mishnah of the Brisa, because what are you telling me you're going to give the Gadol according to the cut and amount? They all have the same shame anyway. Rabbi Yehuda can't be, because Ha'amar, he says in Mesechtes, it's a Mishnah on Daf Pei Zayin. He says in lavadim baishas. He says a slave doesn't have shame. So how could you say that you're going to give the ben chayrin the value of the shame that you would have given to the slave? There is no shame to a slave, so that wouldn't make sense according to him. And Rabbi Shimon, he says niskam levayish potter. He says if you intended to embarrass one person, you embarrass someone else, you actually potter. So obviously he cannot be the Tana, because it's obviously not giving according to how much you intended to shame the person that you were looking for. And my time, what's the reason? Because he says kiktala. We compare the halacha of shame to the halacha of killing someone, as the Gemara says in Sanhedrin Daf Ayin Testament Aleph. Ma katala, just like when you kill a person. Ad miskavan, the liability is only if you had intention for that person. Meaning, if you intended to kill one person, you killed someone else, you're going to be potter. Because the Chsiv the Pasuk says in the Va'arav loy Bava Kama Daf, the guy lay in ambush for him, and he got up on him, which is Aches Kamaloi, until you intended to kill that person. Sabaishas Nami. Regarding shame, also Ad Mechavan, it's also until you have intention for him, because the Chsiv, you have a pasuk in Devarim. So V'sholcha Yada, it says when the woman sees her husband fighting with another man and the other guy is beating up her husband, so she stretches out her hand and she grabs a hold of his shameful parts. And memavushav means aches kavan loy. She intended for his private area, but if she intended someone else and she got someone else, then she's not going to be chayiv. So Reb Shimon doesn't hold you chayiv for niskaven lazeh and uboishe lazeh. So who's the town of the Bryce? It's not like any one of them. Says the Gemara, no. Lo'ilam Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rechi Ka'ama Rabbi Yehuda. When does Rabbi Yehuda say in lavodim boishes? There's no shame for slaves. So how could you qualify that you're going to give to the Ben Chayr and that of the Eved? No, that just means lameis v'lahu. It means that you don't give the Eved shame. But to evaluate, we would evaluate how much would this slave want that the shame should be done for him, and that evaluation is what you give to this free person. It doesn't mean that an Eved doesn't have shame. It just means he doesn't get shame. I mean, he doesn't get the compensation of shame. But he does, and therefore the town of the Mishnah could be Rabbi, the town of the Bryce could be Rabbi Yehuda. Or maybe one thing is Reb Meir. You could even say the town of the Bryce is Reb Meir. How so? I thought you said Reb Meir holds that Ashir and Aniyim both get the same amount. So what's Gadol and Cotton? Says Gemara, no. Gadol and Cotton doesn't mean regarding assets. Me saved Gadol and Chasim, Cotton and Chasim. Why is everything about money? It's not about assets. Loi Gadol mamish. Gadol means an adult. But cotton mamish, and the cotton means a minor. If you intended to embarrass a child and you embarrass an adult, you're going to give the adult according to the value of a child. Says what? What, a child has shame that you're going to give the adult the amount of the shame of a child? Says the Gemara in yes, Kadamar Papa, like a Papa says later on Amad Beis. The michlu mulei or michlim, that you shame him and you get shame. Hachanami Hero says the Ketin Amad Beis, the michlu meaning when you remind him of the shameful incident and you embarrass him regarding it, he gets pained about it. So yes, maybe children don't usually get shame, but if you rub it into him, he feels pain. That's where a child could have shame, and therefore it could even be like Reb Meir. Now look at the next Mishnah. Continuing on this theme about boishes, if someone embarrasses someone who's undressed, or someone embarrasses a blind person, or someone embarrasses someone who's sleeping. Chayiv, you're going to be liable for all these cases, even though they're compromised, as we'll explain. You're still going to be chayiv. Now, v'yashin shabayish pater. If a sleeping person, however, embarrasses someone else, the sleeping person is going to be exempt. Nafam menagag v'hiziku bayish, and even more so, meaning a sleeping person didn't have any kavana, so he's going to be pater. But moreover, nafam menagag. Let's say some guy, he's in the middle of doing some construction on his sukkah, and he falls off the hizik, and he knocks over this guy with his kapata. Everything, his triangle goes flying. Ubayish, and he embarrasses this guy. So chayva nezek. That we know other mud la'olam. You're responsible. I don't care if you're doing your construction and you fall off, you chayv for the damages. But a pater ala baishes, you're exempt for the shame Hashem eskaven until you intended for this to be done. Now the Gemara explains and elaborates in the Brisa. Baishe arum. If someone embarrasses someone who's undressed, says the Brisa chayiv, you're going to be chayiv. And the Brisa explains, because meaning even though that you can't compare embarrassing someone who's undressed to someone who's dressed, but still you're going to be chayiv. But obviously the shame is going to be different. Now, so to embarrass someone in the bathhouse, you're going to be chayiv, and that's a similar theme regarding being undressed. But obviously it's not the same shame embarrassing someone in the bathhouse to embarrassing him in the street. Which Omamar. Now that's what the Brisa says. Now the Gemara expounds on the Brisa that the master said Baisha Arm Chayiv. If you embarrass someone who's undressed, Chayiv you liable. Says Gemara, Agam Bar Baishasu? What, someone who's naked has shame? What do you mean? Since he's not particular to go, undressed in front of people, is he a type of person that could have shame? Now, Taisus explains, and he says, wait, that's difficult. First of all, why is the Gemara asking on the Brisa? If you're saying there's no shame for a naked person, you should have asked it on the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Mavayish aram chayiv." So says Taisus, no. The reason why I don't ask on the Mishnah is obviously someone who's shamed could have a shame. What do you mean? If you spit at a naked person or you slap him in the face, of course you're going to have shame. It's the wording of the Brisa that sounds like Baishay Arum. You embarrass him with this, that you uncover him and undress him. And moreover, the Brisa says this, because the Brisa says you can't compare embarrassing someone who's Arum to embarrassing someone who's dressed. Now, if you spit at him or you slap him, it's going to be the same thing. That's why the Gemara asks, Arum Babaishasu? If he's naked, how could you undress him? And that's the same thing the Gemara is asking regarding Baisha Bebeis HaMerchatz. It's going on Baisha Arum also, where people are generally undressed in the Beis HaMerchatz. And that's why the Gemara asked there also, well, regarding getting undressed, how could you embarrass him? People are generally undressed in the bathhouse. So that Amar Papa says, my Arum, he says, what does it mean naked? It means the asa zika karchinu lamane. It just means the wind came and lifted up his garments. The asahu delinu tfeyo baishe. And then he came along, this other person, and lifted up more and embarrassed him. And that's what it's talking about. But it's not talking about the guy is totally undressed. And Tais explains, he says, yeah, the reason why we said the wind picked it up is because, if the guy himself lifted up and his friend comes lifted up more, he's going to be part of it, because obviously this guy doesn't care about, exposing himself. Or Tais says, no, maybe it's just Urcha de Milsa. Maybe Taka would be the same if the guy lifted up and you lifted up more. Maybe it's just, the norm is guys don't usually expose themselves. But if he did, then you would be chai for doing it more. Al Kapanim, that's how you could have shame for an undressed person, even in undressing, because he's not totally undressed. It's just part of the way, and then you chai for more. And that's similar to what the Gemara asked in the next case. We said, okay, if you embarrass him in the bathhouse, you can be chai. Says Gemara, Beis HaMerchatz bar boishesu? What? People are generally undressed there, so there's no shame over there. Again, Rashi makes it sound like as if you don't become embarrassed in the bathhouse, but Taisa explains it's regarding our being undressed. The guy's undressed. So my puppy says, no, it's not really the bathhouse. The guy's by the beach. He's by the river where people are not totally undressed, and then you expose him more, so then you can be chayiv for shaming him with undressing him, with pulling out his bathing suit, whatever this and that's going to be for the shaming of the undressing. Now, Boyer Baba Mamal, he has the following question. Baishay Yashin. So we spoke about embarrassing a sleeping person, and we said in the Mishnah that you're going to be chayiv. But what happens in the following case? What happens if you embarrass a sleeping person, umeis, and in his sleep, he dies? He never recognizes the shame that you did to him. Oh, so what's the question? Well, what's the halacha? So the Gemara explains, what's he really asking? It's a very important question. Amar Zvid, he wants to get to the principle of why you chayiv for the baishis of a person. So he explains, Amar Zvid, he says, the question like this. Mishum kisufahu? What's the baishis for? Is it because the guy's face becomes crestfallen? V'hamesle, v'lesle kisufa. But he died. His face never changed colors. And because he never became aware of it. So therefore you wouldn't be chayiv for baishis. Dilma, maybe no. Mishum zilusuhu. It's for degrading the person in front of other people. And even if the guy never realized what you did to him, boisle. On your YouTube page, you got 50 million hits from this guy. This guy never knows. He lives somewhere in who knows what. But you degraded the guy. So maybe you would be chayiv and baishis. So what's the halacha? Says Gemara Toshima to bring a raya from the following brisa. The brisa says, Remei Yomi, he says, Chedesh v'katan yesh lem baishis. Says that a deaf mute and a minor has the halacha of baishis, but shaita, a mentally deranged person, ain't like baishis, although cher shaita v'katan usually together. Here they're separate. The deaf mute and the minor are compensated for shame, and the shaita ain't like baishis that doesn't get compensated for shame. Now, says the Gemara like this. If you say that the compensation is because degrading the person, not because they get embarrassed. They have no clue about it. It's just degrading this person. Heinik Tani Cotton. Makes sense why he's saying a child. Child doesn't get embarrassed. But he could be degraded. He could be degrading a human being. So that makes sense. But if you say it's because of shame, you think a child is someone that gets embarrassed? Obviously, it's because of Zilus, and therefore the case of Yashin Amaze, you would have to compensate the family, the estate of this person who died. Says the Gemara, no. Elamai, so what are you telling me? Mishum zilusa? It's because degrading human being? I feel the shaita nami. Then even the guy's mentally deranged. You're right, he doesn't become embarrassed, but you're still degrading the shaita, and you should have to compensate his family or him. Amri says the Gemara, no, shaita en lecha baish is gedolim mizu. If a guy is mentally deranged, there's no greater shame than that. In other words, there's no zilusa even of embarrassing him because you already maxed it out by him being a shaita. So therefore there would be no compensation. So the Gemara says, wait a second. Mikal Malkum still nifshid mina mishum zilusu. Okay, so fine. So you're right. So that's not a good question. So then let's resolve this question and say, must be that's because of degrading, because the imishum kisufa. Then you're right. If it's because of shaming, katan kisubu, you think that a child or someone can be embarrassed. Okay, so that's a good raya. So the Gemara, no, it's not a raya. Why not? Because like Papa said, the michmulei umichlim, that the child. You're right. Children don't usually get embarrassed, but if you like rub it into him, you saw what happened to you, and he gets embarrassed. So then it's going to be shame. It's going to be the same thing. That yes, the child could actually be embarrassed, and if it's not a raya, it could be because of the kisufa, and it doesn't answer our question. Now, Papa he says a slightly different version. This was how Reb Zvid explained the question. Reb Papa says the question that was being asked by Reb Abba Bar Mamel is slightly different, meaning. Yes, option number one is the same. Mishum kisufa didehu is the reason why you compensate some of the baishas because the guy gets embarrassed. You see his face, mamish turns white. He can't believe that this guy is doing this to him. But for Maisle, in the case of when he was Yashin the Mace, he died. So you're right, you're not going to compensate. Dilma, not because zilusa, but slightly different. Zilusa is degrading a person. Maybe it's not because of his shame. Maybe it's because of the shame of the family. It's embarrassing for the family. So then even if the guy never noticed it himself because he died, maybe you would be liable. So on that, Toshima says, okay, the same trying to attempt to derive from the same brisa. The brisa says, it's really very similar type of discussion, just switching from zilusa to baishas mishpacha. The brisa says, chedesh v'katan yeshle baishas, a deaf mute and a minor has baishas. Shaitain le baishas, a mental range doesn't have baishas. Okay. If you think it's because of the shame of the family, okay, that makes sense. One of your kids gets taken for a ride and gets embarrassed. So although the kid doesn't realize it's furious when someone's doing that to your kid. So obviously that makes sense why you would compensate for baishas. But if you think it's because of the embarrassment of the person himself, what do you think? A second grader? You think he has embarrassment? So it says, wait a second. So you're trying to prove that's because of the shame of the family. Then even for the mentally deranged, what it means, it's embarrassing. This nebuch, this child who became mentally or born mentally deranged, whatever, to treat him like this, it's a shame for the family. It says Gemara, no, it's not true. Someone that's mentally deranged, there's no greater embarrassment than that. In other words, there's no compensation even for baishas mishpacha, and that's not a question. So the Gemara says, okay, so then okay, it's a good raya. Let's resolve from this. The mishum baishas mishpacha must be because of the shame of the family. Because the mishum kisuva, if it's because of the shame of the person, cotton bar kisuva, you think a child gets embarrassed? Says the Gemara, Papa says yes, the michlumei u michlem. Yes, you could have a mature child does get embarrassed by others, and therefore it's not a raya to our question. It says the Gemara v'hatanya. And we actually learned in a brisa that this idea of Rav Papa, because Rabbi Yomi says chedesh yesh le baishas, a deaf mute has shame. Shaita ein le baishas doesn't have shame. Ka'atan, so although we quoted before that this baishas, we're saying well it depends, and that's the brisa is explicitly saying like Rav Papa. Pa'amim yesh le, pa'am ein le. Sometimes a child has shame, sometimes not. Had the michlumei michlem. This is that you remind him about what's shaming, and he gets ashamed with it, he gets pain, then he gets baishas. You embarrass him, he doesn't get embarrassed, he doesn't chap what you're saying, then he's not going to get baishas. Now the Mishnah had said, if someone embarrasses a blind person, he's going to be chayiv for shaming that blind person. Says the Gemara, Masnid like Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because he says a blind person doesn't have baishas. Meaning, what does that mean? Meaning, if the blind person embarrasses someone else, he's going to be pater. Our Mishnah taught that a sleeping person that embarrasses someone else is going to be pater. Doesn't say the same thing by a blind person. So that inference is that the blind person embarrasses someone else is going to be chayiv. Meaning, Taisus explains that Rabbi Yehuda agrees that when you embarrass a blind person, that you're going to be chayiv. The question is regarding when the blind person embarrasses someone else. that Rabbi Yehuda holds you're going to be pater. And our Mishnah says that when you embarrass a blind person, it's going to be chayiv. So obviously our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. The time like learn the Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says sumei en lebaishas. Again, we explained the Amarav. What does it mean the blind person doesn't have baishas? Doesn't mean that if you embarrass a blind person, that you're going to be pater. We're talking about if he embarrasses someone else, that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the blind person is meaning if he embarrasses someone else, then you're going to be the Mishnah is actually not from, so it's actually not from the words, meaning it sounds like it's going in the case of Mavaishas Asuma. It's not going on that case. It's the inference from, like Rashi explains, from Yashan Shabayish Pater. The inference from our Mishnah is that Asuma Shabayish is going to be Chayiv. That's where we're saying is not like Rabbi Yehuda, that he holds Asuma in Lebaishas, again, doesn't mean that he agrees to the halacha of the different master was starting in the Gemara and Vaishas Asuma, that you can be Chayiv. But Asuma that embarrasses someone else, that's what it means when he says Suma in Lebaishas. Although the word Suma in Lebaishas would sound like that if you embarrass a blind person, you're pater. Taisus says no. It's clearly Rabbi Yehuda holds that that because that's why we're not saying it straight up from the Mishnah. He's making a dig. But upon him, when a blind person embarrasses someone else, he's going to be pater. And Rabbi Yehuda actually exempted a blind person from many liabilities. Not only when he embarrasses someone else, mechiva galias. If let's say he kills someone by mistake, it doesn't have to go into exile. If he does a negative prohibition, mechiva malchus doesn't get lashes. And if he does something, let's say he chil Shabbos, mechiva misbesin doesn't get executed in court of law. Says my time Rabbi Yehuda, what's the reason Rabbi Yehuda for all these halachas? Says the Gemara, Gomer. So let's go to halacha number 1. Gomer einecha made mezaimin. So first of all, it says in the parish of Edim Zaymin, in the Dvar Yotes, leisachas einecha alav. You shouldn't have compassion on him, on the Eid Zaymin, who has to be executed. By Baishas, it also says ukatzeis es kappa. You cut up the woman's hand. Leisachas einecha, your eye should not have compassion on her. So we have a gzeira shava. And Taisa says that, well, if we're comparing halacha of Eidus to the halacha of Baishas, so yeah, we're saying mahasam sumalai, just like over there, blind people are not able to be witnesses. And the reason why it's pretty obvious why a blind person cannot be a witness, because you have to have, you saw what happened. If you didn't see that this guy cut up his hand, how could you testify? So over here by Baishas, where it says the same word Einecha, you're also not going to have the liability by a blind person. So Tais says, wait a second. So why don't you say, let's say a Gazlan or a Eved, anyone else that's not able to be an aid should also not be liable for Baishas. So that says Tais no, because he says well, you find by a woman's pasla aid that she's having Baishas. The pas explicitly is talking about Vechzig ben Busha by a woman. But then Suma also shouldn't be. He says no, Einecha is dafka regarding your eyes, because it's really talking about bezin. The eyes are what we're saying. The suma doesn't have eyes, so that's literally a necha. That's where we're saying the gzeir shava, but not a universal gzeir shava. Okay, so that's the source that the suma is exempt from if he embarrasses someone. How do you know mechiba galias? How do you know that the blind person doesn't go into exile? It's kind of like learn the brisa. Plus, says Bamidbar. It says if let's say someone kills someone, beloy ra'is, without having seen. Now, without having seen him, it sounds like you see somewhere else. It's only over here that you didn't see him. Prat Suma, the Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, that exempts a blind person. That's how you know that the blind person is not chayiv and galis. Me'yami says, no, actually, l'rabis is a suma. We're actually including, it's coming to include a blind person. Says Gemara, okay, let's explain these two opinions. My time, Rabbi Yehuda, what's the reason, Rabbi Yehuda? I'm going to tell you because it says in the Varm. It says, if a guy's going to come into the forest to chop trees, chop wood, that would sound like anyone, even a blind person. When it says, but he did, and he didn't see him, that's lamud. It's coming to exclude him to say that, it's only he doesn't see here, but he sees somewhere else. Fine, so it's a miyut. Remeir tells you, yeah, you're right, but it says without seeing, which is excluding a blind person. But because Rahman, the Torah also says the passing before that, bivli das, without knowledge, which is also lamud, also coming to exclude, has to have someone who has the awareness. So this is what's called havamir achamir. It's excluding and excluding. When you do a double negative, you actually come out with a positive, which Tosfos wonders. He says, don't write any mute, and therefore by default it would be included. And he says you could ask the question like by in ribach ribe lamayit. Says why do a double negative to end up with a positive? Just don't say anything. He doesn't answer that question. But that's why Remeir holds that actually the blind person would be chayiv. But like upon him, Rabbi Huda, ahubavli das. What does he do with that? Why taka is not for him a mir achamiyad? He says that's teaching you something else. That's coming to exclude. If a guy had intended for this to be, then obviously he wouldn't go into gul. It's only if he did it unintentionally. So he doesn't hold that's a miyut for the case of a summa. But Akaban, that's his source of Belay Ru'ais, is to exclude the blind person from Gullus. And Chiv Misbezin, how do we know that a blind person doesn't get executed in court? Asr Yitzech Yitzech Mechiba Gullius. By Malchus, it says, meaning we learn that from Mechiba Gullius, meaning by Misa, it says in Bamid B'Lamed Hey, Lesikhu Kaifel Nefesh Yitzech. You now take atonement for the murderer. By Gullius, it says Lana Shama Yitzech. So it says the word Yitzech both by Chiba Gullius and Ritzech B'chiv Misbezin, just like we said that the blind person not chayv and gullus, it's not going to be chayv Misbezin either. And Chiv Malkius, how do you know that he's exempt from getting lashes? Asir Rosh Rosh Mechiv Misbezin. By Malkius it says in Ben Akais Rosh. By Misa it says Asher Rosh Lamos. Just like by Misbezin we said he's not chayv, so to Bechiv Malkius he's also not going to be chayv. Now Tanidach we learned another brayso. The Yehuda he says. Summa in lebaishis. A blind person doesn't get any, doesn't have the liability of baishis, like we said this before. And as a continued of Peizayin and Aleph, actually, Yehuda, not only like we said before that he's part of him goals and part of him malchus and part of him bezin, Yehuda exempted the blind person from all judgments in the Torah. My time, what's the reason, Rabbi Yehuda? The pasuk says in Midbar, it says the shaftu eda and the assembly are going to judge ben hamaka, between the one who injured, ubein goel adam, and the redeemer of the blood, al mishpatim eila, for these judgments. Now, what teaches like this? Whoever is in the category of a murderer and whoever is going to have to go into exile and be executed for his murder, yesh mishpatim is included in what the pasuk says the word mishpatim for judgments. And the blind person we already said on the previous amid that we excluded him from the halacha of misbezin. So therefore, he's not included any mishpatim in the Torah. I need to learn another brayso. It says, "Suma in lebaishis," like we said before, the blind person is not liable for embarrassing someone. Yehuda actually exempted a blind person from all the mitzvahs in the Torah. And Amar Rav Sheisha Berei David, this is my time to be. What's the reason of Yehuda? It says Amar Krok, because the pasuk says in Devarim, and the gear says V'zois HaMitzvah HaChukim BaMishpatim, which teaches Kol Sheyeshim BeMishpatim, whoever is in the category of Mishpatim, Yeshim Mitzvah HaChukim. Because we already excluded him from B'Shafta, because we said that's in that pasuk B'Shafta Eidah, it says Bein Maka Goel Adam, it says Al Mishpatim Eila. So we keep on comparing, and just like he's not in Mishpatim, he's not in the mitzvahs and the chukim. So it comes out from all these different drushes, which is interesting if you think about it. The Summa really started off in two places that he's exempt. But then we keep comparing with to show you that the Summa has no chiv mitzvahs in the Torah. Which Taisus says it's a wonder, because he says you find elsewhere in Shas, without going into it, that a blind person is chayiv in mitzvahs. So he says that's midrabanan. And Taisus says a very interesting svara. He says that the reason why that would be that he's chayiv midrabanan is because he says the words are, if you would say a blind person would be part of all mitzvahs, even Rabbanan, it's like a guy. So therefore, rabbinically, they made him chayiv in mitzvahs. It's actually very important. Taisus, the last words over there in Taisus regarding how you understand the chiv of mitzvah of chinuch, that you can't compare the chiv of a summa to the chiv of a cotton shagil chinuch, because it says Taisus gil chinuch is only for chinuch. So although he's chayiv rabbanan, but he's not really obligated himself. A blind person, we obligated him rabbinically, but for chinuch, the child's not really obligated. That goes into the whole clear regarding mitzvah of chinuch. Al kapanim, a blind person, says Yehuda, biblically at least, is part of all mitzvahs in the Torah. So I'm Rabbi Yosef, who, as Rashi tells us, was a blind person. He said, Mereish Havamina, in the beginning I used to say, Mandam Alocha Rabbi Yehuda, whoever tells me Alocha like Rabbi Yehuda, that he says, so part of the mitzvahs, that a blind person exempt from the mitzvahs, I'll make a big holiday, a big suda for the rabbis. My time, what's the reason? because I'm not mechuyev, I'm not commanded in the mitzvah. Cover in the mitzvah, I'm still doing it. Wow, look how great I am. Everyone else has to do it, so fine to do it. I don't have to, and I'm doing it. So I was going to celebrate that. But now that I heard the teaching, Rabbi Chanina says, bigger is the one who's commanded and does misha in mitzvah than someone who's not commanded and he does it. Normally, whoever tells me ain't a loch Yehuda, no. If you tell me that is not like Yehuda, I'll make a celebration. My time is reason because I'm commanded isli igritfei. Then I actually get a greater reward, and therefore I want to be mitzvah isa, and therefore I would rather have the halacha not like any time. Posting us.